With that, Ms. Milton, roll call, please.
Okay, I'm starting with the School Modernization Committee. Mr. Bowman,
Here.
Mr. Gussenberg,
Here.
Ms. Harrigan,
Here.
Jim Jinks,
Here.
okay, Mr. Martelli,
Here.
Mr. Martinez,
Here.
Mr. Neff,
Here.
Ms. Nichols,
Here.
Mr. O'Donnell,
Here.
Mr. Pangaro, Mr. Perugini,
Here.
and Mr. Walsh.
Here.
Town Council, Mr. Orris,
Here.
Mr. Slocum,
Here.
Mr. Burway,
Present.
Mr. Talbot,
Here.
Mr. Veliver,
Here.
Ms. Pavano.
She said she's waiting to be let in.
Yeah, she's
Okay.
here.
All right, we'll go to the Board of Ed. Mr. Grippo.
Here.
Okay, Ms. Ham,
Here.
Ms. Hallen,
Here.
Mr. White.
Here.
We have a quorum of all the board and the commission and town council.
Thank you very much, Ms. Milton. With that, please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, let's roll.
Okay, the first item on our agenda is the presentation of report of School Modernization Committee. And before we turn this over to the SMC and their chairman, Chuck Neff, for their presentation, I certainly want to, on behalf of the council, the Board of Ed, and our entire community, express our deepest appreciation to every member of the School Modernization Committee for not only agreeing to serve, but for your many, many hours of hard work and commitment to the committee and to our community. We know it's been a long process. It's not always been an easy process, but I know all of your hearts are in the right place to find an option that works best for our kids and our community. And I greatly thank you all for that work. Your work is really important, and I'm very confident that we're all looking forward to hearing what the results of all of your hard work is in the presentation. I certainly would be remiss if I didn't thank all of our town and school staff for everything that they contributed to the process. In addition to all their regular work hours, they were involved in most of these meetings or every meeting and really worked hard for this endeavor. So thank you so much to them. And also to many members of our community who engaged during the SMC process. We still have a ways to go, as you all know, and I'm very confident that it's going to be a very open, transparent, and collaborative process. And I'm sure we're all going to have opportunities to continue to weigh in. But we've come a long way, and you guys have all done a lot of hard work. And I just, from the bottom of all of our hearts, want to thank you for everything that you've done. The school modernization effort, I'm truly hopeful that at the end of this, that the collective efforts of our School Modernization Committee, the Board of Ed, the Town Council, and certainly our community will yield a great outcome for school modernization. I truly believe we're all in this for the right reasons. We may not always agree on how to get there, but I do believe school modernization is important to everyone that's on this call. So thank you for that. And again, before we turn it over to the SMC for their hard work, I certainly want to pass it over to my compatriot over on the Board of Ed, Chairman Tony Perugini. Tony, anything you'd like to add?
Thanks, Rob. No, I think you did a great justice there in thanking everyone involved. Lots of folks, and I was just doing some math. This started in the fall of 2019. Honestly, it feels like it was just today in a good way, because at every meeting, all the members, all the volunteers, staff, et cetera, were there. They were part of the discussion, contributing. I think the committee really came together towards the end. A lot of hard work, a lot of details. And I think tonight's report is going to, show the united effort behind this. And I think some great options tonight. So thank you, everyone, on behalf of the Board of Ed and all our public school stakeholders and lots of members of the public. I know they've been in tune, and if they're watching tonight, I know they're very anxious in seeing the report. So again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Chairman Perugini. And with that, I'll turn it over to the School Modernization Committee and their chairman, Chuck Neff.
Thank you, Rob. Chuck Warrington, you want to share the PowerPoint there? All right.
All right, Chuck.
Yep, good to go.
Right.
All right. Thank you again. My name is Chuck Ness. I am the chair of the School Modernization Committee. And as you guys are aware, School Modernization Committee was established as a collaborative effort by the Town Council and Board of Ed to prepare a fiscally responsible plan for upgrading the school facilities in town. We're comprised of 3 town councilors, 3 members of the Board of Ed, and 6 public appointees for 12 total members. You can go to the next slide there, Chuck. We started the process back in November of 2019, as Tony said, and we were really on a fact-finding mission. We started by touring the facilities and assessing their conditions on guided tours by the principal of each school. We set up meetings at each of the schools to hear directly from the teachers and staff about some of their challenges with the physical space and their needs in a 21st century learning environment. We also reviewed information that was available from the previous facility assessment that was performed in 2016, 2017, as well as other building information that was provided by the district. You can go to the next slide, Chuck. In January of 2020, the SMC pursued the services of an owner's project manager, or OPM, to assist in preparing the plan and guide the SMC through this process. In March of 2020, we had selected Collier's project leaders as the OPM. In addition to Collier's, the SMC required the services of a demographer to prepare a detailed enrollment projection for the school district. SLR, which is formerly Milone and McBroom, was contracted to perform those services as well. The onset of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, the committee, like all of you, turned to a remote meeting environment. And through those remote meetings into November, we prepared high-level scenarios for a school modernization plan with Collier's and the direction and input of both the SMC and a subcommittee of members. We developed preliminary budgets and enrollments for that initial list, and 2 scenarios were selected for further refinement based on a weighted scoring criterion. Those 2 scenarios were further refined based on actual enrollment projections, budget details, cash flows, and then preliminary feedback from the State Office of School Construction Grants and Review. And the final 2 scenarios, Scenario 6 and Scenario 2A, were presented to the SMC for final consideration as a recommendation to fulfill our charge. At a meeting of the SMC on March 17th, we voted 9-3 in favor of recommending Scenario 6. And you all should have received a copy of the report last Thursday. Chuck or John from Collier's is going to walk through the details of that report, which is the basis of the recommendation. And they'll detail both the recommended scenario, Scenario 6, and an alternate scenario, Scenario 2A as well. Then I'll turn it back to Mr. Orris and we can answer any questions and go from there. So Chuck or John, you want to take it away and step through?
Yeah, Chuck, I think John should be joining us shortly. I'm looking, I don't think he's joined us yet, but he should be shortly. But I'm going to start our presentation. Good evening. My name is Chuck Warrington. I'm a Director of Project Management with Collier's Project Leaders. Want to thank again the town and the School Modernization Committee for allowing us to assist you with evaluating your program and coming up with these scenarios and working through, all the details over the last couple of months. As Chairman Orris mentioned, there's been a lot of work, a lot of input by all the committee members, and we appreciate your help as well in putting this together. So that we're what you're going to see tonight is a collaboration of a lot of work. It's not just Colliers, it was SLRs, the committee. We're just organizing it and presenting it tonight. What we're presenting tonight is really a synopsis of the report that was sent out on transmitted on April 1st. If there's any questions during the presentation, feel free to ask those. I have the report available if there is a question. We only have about 14 slides. We're going to do an executive, level review, and then kind of go into the questions and answers. So why modernization? I think we all kind of understand why we're here. The schools, the age of the schools are the average age is over 7 years old. Systems are starting to end their use, be at the end of their useful life if they're not there already. The conditions are such that they really need improvement. We've walked through all the buildings, as have probably most of you, and there's certainly need from the facilities perspective in need of some upgrades. And I think just about every building from a physical condition standpoint is probably a good candidate for a renovation in one way or another. The other reason is just 21st century learning. School learning is, I think we all know, is adapted over the years, and the new way of teaching and learning is much different than probably when most of us went to school, and it's constantly changing. There's also challenges since these buildings were built with code upgrades, accessibility, Americans with Disabilities Act for those who are physically impaired and need assistance in accessing the buildings, for sure. Unfortunately, school security has become heightened since Sandy Hook, and that's become a high priority for Connecticut schools and all around the country for that matter. But overall, just the opportunity to upgrade your facilities in every way, physical conditions, again, programming, education, indoor air quality. Obviously, COVID has highlighted some of the, I'll say, shortfalls in some of the facilities, not having as modernized HVAC systems, filtration, if you will, bringing in fresh air. Just basically for the quality of your students and the quality of your quality of environment for your staff. So we start this process in Connecticut. One of the key factors in looking at a modernization plan is really looking at the enrollment. We do this because the state of Connecticut, who we would seek grants from for many of these projects, if not all, this is the basis for which their grant applications are really hubbed around. They look at your entire population for your district. They look at the population in the projected enrollment on a school by school basis. And essentially, the amount of students that are projected to be in your school really drives the size of a school and how much you will build and or renovate. It's a statutory requirement, and we'll talk about the space standard. But we start with that because we need to understand, in addition to the facilities needs, do you have enough room? Do you have enough square foot space in your buildings, enough classrooms to teach the amount of kids that will be coming through in the future years? And the state of Connecticut allows us to look at an 8-year projection on that. Some of the key findings from SLR, who was formerly Malone and McBroom, our demographer. There was a significant uptick in births from 2016 through 2018. It's interesting. I went back and looked at the 2015 study from Perkins Eastman, and it was almost reverse, where the capacity of the high school was showing a slight overage of students versus the elementary schools. That's now kind of reversed. The middle school is in the same condition, but given these bursts and the current projections, we're projecting the elementary schools to have a bit of a deficit in space for that. There's delayed impacted Doolittle because of that kindergarten class is over at Darcy, as everybody knows. They don't hold kindergarten at Darcy. Once it gets redistricted and those grades go back to Darcy, that school will be stressed. And then all the districts, especially at again, the elementary school, because you have multiple ones are expected to grow. And as you can see, Chapman and Harlan are projected to experience the strongest growth trends in upcoming years. But the graph you see here, and this is in our report, is the projections for the current conditions as they are right now, if you were not to change anything for that. So capacity needs of the school, I'm not going to read every bullet, it's a little bit tight. And we've discussed this in the past, is the space standard worksheet. Again, this is the worksheet that the state of Connecticut utilizes to indicate to them and to districts what the size of a building should be. And they use the term space standard. It's basically the size of the building in square feet measured to the inside face of exterior walls. They call that building area. And the way it works is a demographer as SLR will do their projections for the existing, they call it background projections. And for the different scenarios that we've discussed, that we're going to be discussing, they've revised those projections based upon redistricting, closing schools, and changing district lines for each of the elementary schools and or middle school, taking grade 6 and moving up and only having pre-K to 5 for your elementary school. And they give those numbers to us for each of the schools. And what we do, based upon the grade levels housed and the number of students, is we enter them in this spreadsheet here, and it's the same formula for every district in the state. It basically gives us an average square foot per student number. And this one, it's kind of hard to see probably on smaller screens, but the average in this example, which is the scenario 6 scenario that's being recommended, it's telling us 129 square feet per student, multiplied by 653 students. It tells us that the building should be around 84,330 square feet to the inside face of walls. Now, what we do, this is just one tool, and this is key thing is this is a reimbursement tool. Many folks will say, well, that's how much of the building space they're willing to build, and essentially that's correct. But the way it works is, if in this example, 84,330 square feet, if we want to build in excess of that, technically the state of Connecticut would take that 84,330 square feet and divide it into what you want to build. Let's just say if it's 100,000 square feet, that ratio would be 0.84 for simple numbers. And what would happen is you take that 0.84, which is the space standard ratio, and we'd multiply it by your reimbursement rate for that project. In this case, I think it's 35.72 for new. So basically what it is, it's not so much a bill, they're only compensating for so many square feet. It's a reduction of your reimbursement rate that is published. So a little slight difference there. But this calculation really informs us of, again, is there enough space for the students for that school? Or do you need to potentially build more? In combination with the space standard, we also look at the capacity and the way the schools will be programmed, i.e. how many general classrooms are there, how many special education classrooms, and what is the capacity per se. So for SLR, they've been using a figure of 20 students per classroom for most of the grades, and I think 15 or 16 for pre-K and K classrooms. And we kind of look at those at the same time concurrently, determine, okay, do we have enough classrooms and enough space for the students? Because for an existing building, they were designed differently than today's buildings, and probably have a little bit more room. But in essence, the goal is to have the space standard ratio as close to 100% as possible, if not be at 100%, which means it's right sized. And that was one of the factors, if anybody remembers long ago when we first started this, is that what the state of Connecticut's going to look at the space standard ratio, and right off the bat, and they want you to be as closely right size as possible. So, and that's a little bit background for anybody who hasn't seen this before or understands space standard calculations and how the enrollment projections come into play in all these important scenarios. Mentioned the functional capacity of the schools. So when SLR looked at the schools, they met with the administrators, gathered data on how many homeroom classrooms, general classrooms there will be, and other important programming to calculate what the capacity is of each of the schools. And they base upon students per general classroom, typically, and the number of sectors of grades. The sectors are how many, third grade classroom or fourth grade classrooms there are in each of the schools. And so these graphs, it might be a little fuzzy as we extracted these from SLR's presentation back in October for the elementary schools. And in these graphs, the orange bars are the projected enrollments. The solid blue line is the what they call the functional capacity or the total capacity of the building. And the dotted line below is what they're saying the target capacity, which represents 90% of the functional or total capacity of the school. The reason they do that is shooting for a 90% capacity or usage allows that 10% for fluctuations in your grades and populations, so that if you have a bump or a bubble coming through, you can accommodate that in the grades. So it's a goal. It's not necessarily statutory, but it is a factor looked at in combination with the space standard. So we look at these concurrently to try to get the building to be right-sized, look at the programming, and a lot of other factors. In these, if you simply observe, you look at the blue lines and the ones that are higher in the graphs, such as Chapman and Norton, Doolittle and Highland, those are indicating, that we're going to be, at or over capacity in the next 8 years. Certainly Highland, where those orange bars are rising above that solid line, we're exceeding capacity. Norton's going to be approaching another 6-7 years. That'll be an exceedance, as well as Chapman. Darcy is indicated to be there already. And Doolittle shows it's going to have enough capacity, again, for the existing current condition. So what this is telling us is which buildings need some more space, which ones might be, as in the existing conditions, which ones are okay. And really just Doolittle is the only one that really can afford not to expand a little bit. So again, kind of summarizing this, the capacity, they're utilizing a class size of 20 to 21 students for general education grades, I think 1 through 6 and 8 to 15 for special education, early childhood, pre-K. Again, Darcy projected to exceed target enrollment and functional capacity next year. Again, with the pre-K program being located there. And again, Chapman in the next 3 years, and ultimately Highland as well. Again, Doolittle, that we're seeing that does have some capacity as is. And then again, Norton, another 6 or 7 years will be beyond its capacity. In their study, they indicate that the middle school as is and the high school has sufficient room in those facilities for the projected enrollments. So they indicate a stress there. So this data with elementary school has been one of the primary drivers in some of these solutions, as you'll see. Again, we look at facilities, the conditions of the facilities, but if you run out of room, you're going to be stuck. And if we don't do anything about it, that's when we start discussing portables being added on the schools. And I think we can all agree portables are not ideal for students to learn in last case scenario. So taking in that data, we looked at, again, the existing conditions, but looking at the enrollment projections. We wanted to take a data-driven approach as we develop the scenarios. Many times, Colliers, when we've worked with other districts, folks who have worked for years with the district or in a town, there's some preconceived notions of what the solutions are. And not necessarily data-driven, based upon either enrollment projections, or physical conditions, and taking a really hard look at, I'll say the guts of the buildings, the mechanical systems, electrical systems, window, hazmat, hazardous materials, conditions, caulking, asbestos, et cetera. But we want to have data-driven recommendations to be able to back those up. We also take a holistic approach to the district-wide, not just on a building-by-building basis. This is a recommendation recently published in the last couple of years from the state of Connecticut. Years ago, they were receiving grant applications for just one project, and instead of looking at their district as a whole to see where they can potentially either redistrict or better utilize their facilities, they were just getting one for one school and finding that districts had space in other areas to move students around. So essentially, they want us to look at it as a holistic approach. And then again, the physical square foot needs as part of the data. When we first started them, we had a lot of scenarios. We had about 13 different scenarios. Some of them were variations of each other, variations in the phasing and how we looked at it. So the options, the 1A for those who remember was a new, a large new elementary school. 2A was started with the middle school, which is the alternative option. Some of the other options were, and then ultimately would be modifying, renovating the remaining elementary schools, Dodd Middle School and the high school. Other options were basically just reverses of those, of starting with either the high school or Dodd Middle School, and then ultimately renovating and adding on to your elementary schools. And then other variations included developing or improving the schools through your CIP plan, which are smaller maintenance type programs, window replacements, a roof replacement, a boiler replacement, miscellaneous upgrades versus a holistic renovation of a school, which basically makes it to a like new condition for 20 years. So when we say renovation, it's renovate like new. Many have heard that term. And again, everything in the building is touched, everything is upgraded to a like new condition for a lifespan of at least 20 years, if not more. Also, during the process and the scenarios, as we were developing the scenarios for the buildings themselves, we're also doing preliminary evaluation of potential parcels in the town that might be available to house one or more of these buildings that we're proposing. They were purely on a very high level. We did not perform any site investigations. That's really the next step in the process. But we basically looked at what's the in some cases, what is the acreage? Because the state recommends a minimum acreage, depending on the type of school. Elementary schools, 10 acres plus one for every 100. Middle school is 10 acres, 15 acres plus one for every 100 students. And we also, so that was the only thing we really looked at is the size of the acreage. We tried to look at topography in some cases, see if there's steep topography. We were given a list from the town of open spaces, ones that had deed restrictions or not. And there's essentially only about 4 of those that had the possibility of being developed as a school. We also, in the study, you'll see, we also looked at other parcels within town along the Route 10 corridor, very randomly, not specific, really just looking at by observation on GIS, the size of the parcel to see if it had the minimum acreage, and then how much was the assessed value, so that we could put a placeholder in the budgets for purchasing property if needed. It was really just an exercise to understand what's the cost of a property going to be if you need to buy it. We didn't target any specific ones or name them because it was really just to procure an average, and that was around $53,000 per acre is what we found for most of the parcels on average. Through these scenarios, Colliers, we developed what we call high-low budgets because we don't have an ed spec yet for these with a specific program. But what these budgets are total project budgets. They include your hard costs, which are construction costs. They include fixtures, furniture, and equipment. They'll include all your fees and expenses, architect's fees, commission agent fees, stormwater monitors, owner's rep, materials testing. And then ultimately, the only thing that's not included in those is the bonding and borrowing fees that you would pay for financing costs. I think that's the only thing that's not in there at this point. But there is escalation as well, because depending on when the project is anticipated to occur, we need to account for escalation. If it's 8 years out, you could have multi-millions of dollars in escalation, especially when we look at the high school. That's a large building. We have to account for that cost of money. And then ultimately, owner's contingency as well. You got to make sure you have extra money for the unforeseen conditions or betterments that you may have. But we did a high-low analysis on those, as well as what we call a district share calculator. So what when we look at these district shares, what those are doing is they're accounting for a certain amount of ineligible costs, because every project, and we can't stress this enough, every project that goes through the grant commitment process with the state will have ineligible costs in one way, shape, or another, depending on its status. Renovation and new projects have typically less ineligibles than, say, an alteration project for many different reasons we won't get into tonight. But we assume about 7.5% ineligibles on average. And then that tells us what your eligible cost is, and we'll eventually apply your reimbursement rates, whether it's the 36% or the 46%, to it, to get an idea of what your district share will be ultimately for these. And these will vary. They're going to be highly dependent on the final audit with the state and what you end up borrowing for that. We took those estimates and budgets, and we developed and extracted cash flows to give to the town to Jim Jascott, so he can see what the cash flows would be for these scenarios. He can look at the borrowing and I'm sure Jim will speak to that later, but basically, how does that fold into the rest of your debt service with the town in a nutshell for it. And finally, as we went through all the scenarios, graded the scenarios, there's a lot of scoring sheets out there. Essentially, we came down to the two options that Chuck Neff mentioned. Option scenario 6 is the recommended, and alternate 2A is scenario 2A is the alternate one. So that's kind of a high level review of how we kind of got to that. The recommended scenario 6, a summary here. And this scenario was the result, I think, of a couple different factors. I think it was selected in lieu of the 1A option. And if Chuck, if you correct me if I'm mistaken here at all, but the 1A option that we looked at first was a estimate about 900 plus student enrolled K-6 grades K to 6, which would have been a very, very large school.
Yeah, it was about 854, I want to say was the number. We had eliminated that and settled on this scenario 6, which is here.
Yeah, so that's a very large school in Connecticut. You don't really see elementary schools that large unless maybe you're in some of the larger cities, maybe Norfolk, Stamford, maybe not even Fairfield. But it's really not seen too often throughout Connecticut. It's certainly the size when we talked to the state with OSCGR that they weren't a fan of. They certainly like to see them smaller as well. And then as we were discussing this, I think even a couple of the members had maybe come up with this idea of why don't we split it up and make these more even sized. So six came as a result of refining, I think, 1A and right sizing the schools equally. So one is recommended kind of in the north part of town, one maybe at the south part of town, potentially at Norton. That hasn't been decided, but those are some of the options we looked at. In this option, existing Darcy and Chapman lines, the Chapman buildings were taken offline. So that North School would basically somewhat replace Chapman, get right sized, move the district lines around. And then Darcy, those programs would go into Highland for the pre-K programs there. And again, in this option, we would basically redistrict the elementary schools. And in this option, all of them are more closely sized together instead of having one really large school and a couple others that are really small. They're all closer to being right sized to each other. The impact of this, I think, is estimated about 18% of the population would be affected by this redistrict. That's one attractive trait in that 1A option we talked about. It was like about 40%. Really large redistricting in that option, so that was undesirable. So that would be phase one, is building these 2 elementary schools and then redistricting after that. And then phase 2 and 3, this is an area for that could be modified in the future depending on how your program evolves and how enrollments go. A lot of other factors in town, your debt service, et cetera. Would be renovations to Doolittle and Highland as K-6 schools. So then you would have all 4 updated, a renovation to Dodd Middle School and potentially renovation to the high school or potentially new high school. I mean, when you get that far down the road, you might change your mind. We're saying renovation, but this plan will modify and grow and adapt through the years, I'm sure. So that could be modified. And then the Hummiston and Board of Ed offices are to be determined. This is certainly a hot topic, and what gets done with that. The key thing with this is that it's not on what we call the critical path. That can be done at any time that you wish. You could put Board of Ed offices in either of the new schools if you wish, but that will not impact the capacity enrollment projections for the elementary schools, and that's really the key factor in this program is addressing that. So that can happen anytime, and that's certainly a point of issue within the town. Then again, as the future phases are planned and you're developing, these plans may change. But for today's discussion, that's scenario 6. So a little bit of the financials. Again, behind this spreadsheet you see here is a lot of other spreadsheets and revisions and a lot of detail that goes into this. And this is just our summary sheet for scenario 6. Again, these are 2 new elementary schools, K-6, with enrollments of 653 and 669 for SLR's projections. So it's in between that 400 to 700 enrollment that the state of Connecticut would like to see. Again, I think that's pretty typical around the state of Connecticut to be between those. In the first columns, you see the building size again. In these, we call them the gross square foot. It's these numbers are factored up from the building area because, or the space standard calculation. That space standard calculation does not account for the exterior walls of the building, which typically constitute 4 to 6% of the overall building. So you take 4 to 6% of 70,000 square feet, your 3,000 square feet, you multiply it by $350 a square foot, you're in the millions, and you're gonna end up with a budget crunch. So anyways, the building size, we've made some assumptions, the low being the space standard multiplied by that factor. The high, we've added another 10% onto the space standard because we're seeing that many of the special education programs, OTPTs, medically fragile type programs take more space. And the state of Connecticut has typically supported more square footage for these programs because, and Dr. Solon can allude during our discussions with OSCGR, they want students placed in the town. They do not want them outsourced. They want them in town with their peers, and they support those programs very much. So the building size in any building budget typically drives most of the budget. Construction budgets, or what we call hard costs, typically 75 to 80% of your budget that we find. So that's why that square footage is so important. Developed a low budget and a high budget. Again, some of the variables is the size of the building, but also some of the assumptions we use for the site costs. Depending on how big the site, that can range from 18% of the building costs up to, we've seen 25 to 27%. So we put a range on that. And then also the FF&E, we know those costs, that's your furnitures, fixtures, and equipment. The desks, the chairs, filing cabinets, AV equipment, playground equipment, maintenance equipment, anything. If you take the building upside down and you turn it over, it's going to fall out of the building essentially. So that's FF&E, that's included in there, comprehensive, all the fees and expenses. Again, the architect, we've been assuming, I think, 7% of the construction and FF&E fee for architect's fees. And again, all the consultants and services that will be required, commissioning agent, OPM, CM fees, materials testing, labs, printing, advertising, goes into these budgets. And I think we have a sample of that in the report to give you a level of detail. So in this scenario, you can see the range for the two schools in phase one, 108 million to approximately 130 million. And that's again just for the first two schools. And then the far right-hand side is the estimated district share. So this, as I alluded to, this takes the total project budget. We assume about 7.5% ineligibles. So we subtract that off the top, kind of like if you're getting, going to school and getting a loan, and they'll take all those scholarships off the top and then look at the remaining amount to see how much they're going to give you. We call that the eligible portion. In all these cases, we're assuming that there's not going to be a reduction in your reimbursement rate. We assume we'll get a space waiver in these numbers. If for some reason the SBEC requires more space and they don't give it to us, these could be modified a little bit. So the district share for these first two are between 72.5 and 87.4 million for these two schools. Continuing below, and again, the phases 2 and phase 3, these programs, Doolittle, Highland, these I believe have the capacity to move forward as is with some alterations, maybe some slight additions, but we're trying to size them so we wouldn't have to kind of keep it in line with, we do phase 1, do we need to do phase 2? That has some flexibility with this program. For those, you can see the size of the buildings there are pretty much the existing size. There's a little bit of an addition at Doolittle by the difference there. You can see the ranges there. If anybody has any questions, again, please ask me. I assume you can see it all and look at the high and lows. We included renovation for that as a 7-8. That's a pretty large school, 135,000 square feet, ranging from 65 to 80 million there. And then renovation to the high school, we've shown that as a 2030 midpoint of construction. So again, that escalation cost is what's kind of driving these up a bit. That's a large school, 278,000, ranging from 153 million to 189 million total cost, with a share of 88 to 109 million. And we also included some costs for Humiston. These numbers, the low budget is the CIP numbers that are being carried over the next 5 years or so. And the high budget is an estimated cost to renovate that building. Again, high level, we have not done investigations on hazardous materials. We didn't do an FCA, but it's real high level based upon your square footage in there. So in summary, this program, if you do the entire program, we estimate it to be between 428 million and 540 million. Again, depending upon many different factors, as I mentioned, and an estimated district share of 259 million to about 330 million in total. So again, a lot of numbers, a lot of background goes into these. I went through this quickly, and I'll be happy to go back and answer any question on these when we get to the Q&A.
Oh, they must have changed that number. Okay.
The scenario 2A, this is the alternate that the SMC voted on. This is for a new 6 to 8 middle school, and also a new K-5 elementary school to replace Chapman, potentially on its existing site, depending on how a test fit works on that site to build in occupied mode. Existing Darcy would be taken offline, and all those students again would go to Highland, and Chapman would have to be demolished as part of that new elementary school should it be built on that site. And then redistricting would be required as well to right size the enrollments for the remaining elementary schools. Again, phase 2 and 3, similar to scenario 6. renovations of Doolittle, Highland, and Norton. It's K-5, ultimately renovations to the high school. In this scenario, with building a new middle school, grades 6 through 8 go to the middle school. Dodd would be available. All that space would be available for potentially moving the Board of Ed and Humison operations there possibly. But the use of that would be determined in the future. We understand it wasn't under the SMC charge to determine that at this point for that. Similar to 6, we developed a summary of costs for these. Again, same description, same process for both of these. For phase 1 of this program, again, a new middle school and new Chapman K-5. Large enrollment here, 6 to 8, there's almost 1,200 students projected for grades 6 to 8. There's really not many middle schools out there that are this large for these grades. Only one I'm aware of is your neighbor down in Hamden. Theirs is projected at 1,352, I believe. When they redistrict next year, I think they're redistricting in 2022. The phase 1 costs here would be estimated between $154 and $186 million, with an estimated district share of $103 million to $124 million. So this is higher than the option 6 for the phase 1. And again, the remaining renovations to the remaining elementary schools and the high school, again, they vary in the cost and the size depending on their enrollment. I'm not going to go through point by point. If you have a question, I'd be happy to answer those. And then again, Hummiston, we assumed the CIP plan for the low of the 4.4 and a complete renovation of estimated around $14 million. This total plan for scenario 2A, the low would be $437 million to roughly $550 million, with an estimated district share between $268 million and $340 million. Again, a lot of these can change and move as we go. And all of these estimated district shares, as we went through and developed cash flows, we did take a look at the CIP plans developed by the Board of Ed and the specific projects that were out there. And what we had recommended for as a school was projected to be renovated. We may have recommended not proceeding with certain projects, because if you're, instead of doing a re-roofing project, if you're renovating that school in the next 2 years, most districts will choose to limp along, Band-Aid the roof as necessary to keep leaks from occurring, or window replacement, boiler replacement, et cetera. But you don't want to put in new systems and then renovate the building later. So I think it's our last slide here before questions and answers. Comparisons of the 6 and 2A. The impact of the percentage of the students in the redistricts very similar, 18 and 15% respectively. Again, 1A, when that was looked at, was I believe around 40% on that. You got John joining us now, it looks like. Again, the estimated district share for phase 1 of the respective scenarios is approximately $37 million difference between the two of those, between 6 and 2A being higher. Average tax impact for average taxpayer for phase 1 projects over the next 5 years differs by about $223 per household annually. Again, 6 being lower than 2A, purely on the size of the budget. And again, the projected enrollment for these schools we mentioned, we did go up March 11th to go meet with the state after having initially met with them, shared our thoughts on scenarios, and those enrollments for the elementary schools are ideal for them in the right range for Connecticut. The 2A middle school, it's higher. They like to see it smaller. It's not impossible to do, but they'd want to see good arguments for that and understand why you want to go that large. In both scenarios, Darcy, Chapman are taken offline or replaced in some way, shape, or form. In 6, Norton's taken offline with an assumed new school to southern side of town. In 2A, Darcy's taken offline and replaced by that new middle school. So you noted the enrollment's unbalanced, and Highland's got a high population there, but in scenario 6, they get closer to the right sized. They're in that 650 to 800 number, which is much more balanced approach. In 2A, they would remain somewhat unbalanced to a degree. In summary, as Chuck alluded, the SMC voted ultimately on to recommend scenario 6 based upon all these factors. I think scenario 6 hits a lot of boxes. Is it perfect? I don't think any scenario is, but it hits a lot of boxes. I think from right sizing, addressing your enrollment needs, the conditions of the schools, your modernization, and then from a phase 1 budgetary aspect, gets its relative if it's being affordable. It's up to your committees to decide that, but it's more attractive than the 2A. So with that, I think, Chuck, we will turn it over to Mr. Orris and the committees for Q&A.
I think Rob sent it back to you. I don't know how we can coordinate this with so many people, but you can try your best.
Yeah, we'll do the best we can. Thank you, Mr. Warrington. Thank you, Mr. Nuth. Again, thank you to the full SMC committee. With that, I'll open it up to questions or comments from members of the Board of Ed and or the Town Council. And hopefully I can see just about everybody, but if not, just please jump in and let me know that you're interested in asking a question if I don't see you. So any questions or comments? Mr. Talbot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not one to be shy. I guess I'll go first. First of all, I can't thank the committee enough for the incredible work that they put in over the course of the better part of, well, coming up on 2 years, I guess, to come up with this. So thank you for all of the work that you put in. It was certainly above and beyond what we had asked you for originally, and it is much appreciated. There is obviously a lot to digest here, even having received an advanced copy and having a chance to look through it. So I'm sure there's more questions to come, but I did have a couple that I wanted to address tonight. And the first two kind of center around enrollment. The first was, if I was reading the slide correctly, Mr. Warrington, and it was a little bit small, but when you were talking about the projections and you mentioned Darcy reaching its or going over capacity next year, it appeared to me at least to be like a 50 student increase. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I think that's primarily due to our COVID situation. A lot of my understanding, a lot of parents are keeping, students at home this year. So
Okay.
that's, I think the 2021's reflected an actual, and as you can see through the years going out, it raised up, and I think that's due to COVID this year and that impact.
How and then I'll throw this out there. I don't know if this is a question for Dr. Solon or for the committee, but the projections that were done by Mylone and McBroom, and I was kind of comparing that with the projections of enrollment that was in Dr. Solon's budget book. And I guess I'm a little confused about the projections. I know it doesn't automatically follow births, but if it does follow births, that it also means that there is a large influx of young school age children into town. So can somebody talk to the methodology either of the service that CPS uses or how Mylone and McBroom came up with their enrollment projections?
I can address that, Peter. NESDEC, the New England School Development Council,
Right.
is the group that we use for our projections. Actually, they're slated to provide us an update on their projections. They usually do that in the spring. So in the coming weeks, we expect to have that. But they are predominantly using birth rates. And as an example, this year's incoming kindergarten class, there were 165 births in the corresponding year. Next year's class is 205 and 200 plus for the next several years. So we're seeing a significant jump in birth rate. SLR, or formerly Malone and McBroom, they use a more comprehensive approach, not only looking at birth rates, but something they call persistency ratios. So when an individual, how many births are there, but then what does that look like relative to the number of actual enrollments? So what we find is that the persistency ratio for kindergarten is 1.5 students enroll for every student born in the corresponding year. They also look at things like there's been a significant amount of development in Cheshire in the last year or currently going on in terms of homes. The Weiss Road development will be the next online in that process. So they're more comprehensive in their approach. Chuck, I don't know if there's anything, or Vin, that you want to add to that explanation.
No, I think that was perfect, Jeff.
Thank you, Dr. Solon. That's very helpful. And then to Chairman Neff, you guys had two scenarios that were presented tonight by the SMC. I guess the question, the short way to get to the question is, why weren't they just presented as option A and B as opposed to 1 and 1A? Why was a preferred option chosen as opposed to two equal options for both the BOE and the council to weigh?
That's a good question. Something we wrestled for a while at the committee level, and ultimately we decided that we wanted to present a recommended scenario, which again was favored by a good majority. I think we had put a lot of time and effort into scenario 2A. Again, it was on the table for the year's time in pretty much the form that it ended in. So presenting the facts that we came up with as an alternate, but ultimately I think they aren't equally weighted as you see in the votes that were attached to them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. More to come, sir, I'm sure.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Talbot. And
Mr. Slocum with a question, if it's available.
Yeah, Tim, hold on. I think Tim
Okay.
White was just before you. If you don't mind, Tim.
Not at all.
You had your hand up? No? Okay, we'll go to Tim Slocum then.
Mine is a question which I think will be answered, has to be answered in both scenarios. And it has to do with how do our student counts, our enrollment counts follow each of these plans? In other words, as we phase in renos over time in the out years per se, are they going to meet the needs of the population in those schools? In other words, assuming that we have the younger years that are filling up our schools sooner rather than, say, the middle school, it's likely to assume that as we renovate the, say, for example, Dodd and then the high school, when many people may be fatigued, those schools will still hold the capacities of the projections. Have we measured things in those ways? You may say you have, and I just wasn't paying attention clearly enough, but just if you could answer that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
Chuck, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I'll take a crack. So when SLR was engaged to do what they call the background projections, they went out 10 years. Anything beyond 10 years, from what they've told us, it starts to get that model you start to diverge, and the accuracy is, you're probably more so guessing than I'll say an accurate model. I'm probably not doing it justice. But as we're looking at all these different scenarios, they do look at the growth through the years. The state of Connecticut allows us to look at a maximum of 8 years out. So that's the state. They went out 10 years. So they did look at all these scenarios going 10 years out, and looked at the middle school and ultimately the high school. And as of right now, they're saying, yes, those facilities will be able to accommodate those future projections. And any program like this in other districts we've had, we've continued to update the projections and keep an eye on those as we progress, so that if you have to adjust, we had one, we brought Dr. Carter in from South Windsor, where the school we're designing right now is the enrollment's 803. It was actually 693 for K-5. When that started in the program in 2014, it was around 350 to 360 students. So over the course of 6 or 7 years, because of growth, build a day will come and other factors, that's doubled in population. So we would certainly recommend, as you progress through your program, to keep an eye on your enrollment, see what the trends are doing, and make sure those are holding true. And if they are starting to increase or decrease, make those adjustments accordingly.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Slocum. I think I see Mr. Bowery.
Yes, sir.
And then we'll
Thank
go
you,
to
Mayor
Mr.
Orris.
Grippo.
All right. Of the SMC, unbelievable work, lots of good information. I was actually talking to Mayor Orris earlier today and said, you guys have presented so much information and gathered so much information. Now that this is in the hands of the elected officials to move forward, we will have that at our fingertips as needed, even if it's items that weren't necessarily in the report. It's there. So we owe you a debt of gratitude for that. I do have a couple of areas that I want to ask, and maybe Chairman Neff would be the right one to ask about this, but did your committee, and I didn't hear it in the meetings, did you guys talk about maxing out the existing space or the planned excess capacity that's already there? In other words, the high school is going to have quite a bit of excess capacity. Did you talk about what might go there in order to maximize the use of our space before we ask that additional space be added within the school system?
So in terms of the high school, the initial thoughts, when we were looking at high level scenarios, we had talked about doing the high school first as one of those scenarios. But really the enrollment projection, as Chuck said, was the critical path. We had to address the enrollment.
I think you froze.
Chuck, I think we're losing you.
Projections through school. So it really wasn't an option.
You froze up a little bit, Chuck.
Am I better now?
You better now, yeah.
I can hear you. Yes, sir.
Sorry. So I was saying the enrollment projection at the elementary level was critical. We wanted to
Right.
make sure we addressed that in phase one. So the high school in phase one wasn't a consideration. And again, looking at the chart of the enrollment out, at that 10 years, you're at 1262 in year 2930, where it starts to tick up again. And the capacity is shown as 1666. So we had never really considered anything for that space. As we talked about Humiston in the alternate high school, there was some discussion as far as the alternate high school and some of that space that was available going in there, but no decision was ever really formalized for that with the committee.
All right, I appreciate that. One thing I will want to look on as we move forward with this is what we can do to maximize the space. And with this considerable excess capacity at the high school, it might make sense to be used for something. I'm not saying, move the 15,000 square feet from Humiston, but that will need to be looked at, I think, as one of the items that I would want to look at. Actually, a minor question. Is there a cost to renovating Highland in order to bring the Darcy program there? And if so, I didn't see it in phase one. but the intention of taking Darcy offline in phase one is there. So I wondered if there's maybe no cost necessary to Highland to get it ready for them.
Chuck, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had said that would kind of depend on the spec for the space for the pre-K and the early development moving in there as far as what that would be for renovation. Is that right?
Yeah, so based upon enrollment, the space, when we talk about that space standard as an initial indicator, I don't have the number right in front of me, maybe John Copus will find it, but we're coming up with about a 91% space standard ratio, which means indicates you have enough room. But even in that 90 percentile range, what's really important when we get to that point is looking at the programming of the building and the actual spaces themselves and going, okay, although the building in total has enough space, is it arranged in such a way that'll support bringing that program in? So that's something we put a caveat on that we need to take a look at and determine, does the existing classroom spaces and configurations, are they suitable, with modifications, add in bathrooms, maybe in the smaller grades. Right now it's indicating that we don't have to do additions, but we would have to do some alterations in there. So we'd have to study that a little bit more because we don't want to assume it and then go, okay, we need maybe 2 classrooms for the general classroom space or special education spaces. It's really dependent on that spec.
It sounded like maybe the numbers aren't of an order of magnitude that it would change significantly between the 72 million for phase.
No, I don't think so. We assume the whole thing being renovated. So.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I think we had assumed it would fall in between the low and the high value that we had on there still.
Okay. All right. And then the last one, because obviously there are other questions, as Councilman Talbot said, there's a lot more coming, but just one more. And this is about around the community. And I didn't hear a lot of discussion during the SMC's deliberations, but the reality is only a few years ago, we had the same number of students in our elementary schools that we're going to project to have a few years from now. So what would the justification be for what happened to that space, if you will? I understand kindergarten going all day took some of it. And I understand special ed may have taken some because we're housing kids in-house more and more, which is ideal and what we should be doing. But I don't know if you're going to want to make a comment now, either Chuck or Chuck, but that's one of the things that I think is going to need to be fleshed out more and have more of a public discussion over the ensuing months. This is in the hands of the elected officials, because I just see that need and unanswered to a satisfactory degree.
Understood. Jeff Solon, did you want to maybe comment on that? I know you had put in some effort there.
Yeah, sure. Vin and I had developed and shared with the School Modernization Committee the kind of the historical high population at those elementary schools, the current population, and where the space has been really developed. And that's, as you mentioned, moving from half day to full day kindergarten obviously doubled the number of rooms you need. That's a significant impact, obviously. Then special education, we've made a very concerted effort, as I think Chuck Warrington mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, to bring identified students back to certainly a better service delivery model for those students, but actually cheaper as well, more cost effective for us in the community. The compromise there is space. It takes space for us to be able to do that. And so I'm certainly happy to share with this, with the council as well, the document we put together.
I would appreciate that. That would be very helpful. Thank you. Appreciate it, Dr. Solon. All right, Mayor Orris, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. I think we were going to go to Mr. Grippo.
Thank you, Mr. Orris. Firstly, I'd like to thank the SMC for their hours upon hours of work, months and years of work put into this plan that you finalized. And as some of the members know anyway, that I've been following along. I try and watch almost every meeting that you had to get really immersed in the details. The one question, well, two questions, and I wasn't sure if we're going to come upon this later. It's a financial question. But firstly, I'm not sure if Tim Slocum's question was answered. I didn't hear the answer, which was if 2 new elementary schools are built to absorb this new population bump, is the is Dodd Middle School large enough to absorb that new population bump in the 7th and 8th grade before they get to that what I guess is perceived the excess capacity at the high school? Will Dodd be is it large enough to hold that population bump?
Answer is yes. That's what we've been told by SLR.
Okay. And secondly, I don't know if we're going to see a financial analysis later or not, but just by my thought, it looked like for at least the 2 elementary school option, there would be it looked to me at least $10 to $20 million in CIP savings by not having to renovate Norton and or Chapman by building new. And I just wasn't sure if any of that had been formalized by the town, if that analysis is at least in the ballpark of correct.
John Copeless, you're online. John put together our cash flows. And John,
Yes.
do you recall what those numbers might be, the savings in scenario 6, I believe we're talking about what we had taken out? Because in our cash flows, we tried to identify year by year. We showed the positive, what they had a plan for, but also showed the negative to cancel it out, so we can see that in our analysis.
Hey, Chuck, hang on with that, because in the final report, if you're looking at the cash flows that are in there, I believe we had removed that information as well as the cost savings from closing certain.
Yes, that was excluded from those numbers, Chuck.
And just presented the costs. So to answer the question, I don't have a final tally of what it would be in the final scenarios tonight, but we can
We have
certainly
those we do
get
have
that.
those calculated though, for whatever was accounted for.
Okay, so that's something we can come across later then in our deliberations.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, John
Thank you.
can bring up our spreadsheet. We can show you.
great, thanks. All set.
Thank you, Mr. Grippo. Other questions or comments from, yes, Ms. Allen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few things that I'm a little bit confused about, but so one, I guess, factor in favor of scenario 6 was balancing the enrollment across the elementary schools. But as I look at, 2A versus 6, it seems to me that the 2A balances pretty well across all of the elementary schools, although Highland is significantly higher. But Highland's significantly higher than the other 3 elementary schools in scenario 6 as well. And we have in scenario 2A, the number of children is much more around, 400 to 500, except for Highland. And in scenario 6, they're getting much closer to the 700 maximum number that I thought that the state was looking for. So that was I was a little bit confused by the fact that, the balancing is not all that compelling to me when you are looking at larger, 4 larger elementary schools versus what we would have if we did a 6 to 8 middle school, and then it was just K through 5. So I don't know if Chuck Warrington can sort of speak to that, but you seem to suggest that the state would look at scenario 6 in a more favorable light because of that rebalancing.
Yeah, just to clarify, I think the difference, and I don't want to speak for the state at any time, but basically
right.
we talked about, I think the what might be compelling on the 6 for them is more so about the middle school than the elementary schools, and the balancing is really subjective of if we're balancing them, to be honest. I mean, how we interpret it, but the 2A really is about the middle school being almost 1,200 students, and them really wanting, their recommendation is closer to 900 students. So that would be I'll say the compelling argument from the OSCGR side, if I was to state that. As far as the balancing within the elementary schools outside of that, in the 2A option, you have New Chapman was projected at 515, Doolittle 570, and Norton at 463 versus Highland being 751. So you're 180 larger than the next largest, which was Doolittle. And then in the 6A option, and I'll just show this quickly.
Right, now it's a smaller delta.
It's a smaller delta. Highland's still the biggest one just because of its sheer size. But the other three, you can see, they are higher because they're K-6 versus obviously K-5.
Right. Okay, that's one question I had. So in the case of, let me just say, the 6 to 8 middle school, even if it is large, the state could be convinced that it's an okay size, depending on, whatever justifications that we would bring to the table. And I guess my question is, what kinds of justifications would you expect the state would be interested in? And would it make a difference to them if the middle school was structured in a way where the 6th grade was like kind of in a slightly separated building pod, and the 7th and 8th were in a different building, kind of with a connection or something? I mean, I'm just trying, because I've heard what you're saying, that they didn't love the idea of an 1,100 student population in the middle school, but they're not saying absolutely not. So what kinds of things do they look at for that?
And I'll ask, maybe Jeff can opine on it as well, Dr. Sullivan. I think the compelling arguments, I suspect, and I haven't had to make this argument in other districts, so it would be new to me, to be honest, would really be, I think, how you want to educate and your program and your philosophies of having a 6 to 8 versus a 7 to 8 and the K to 6. I think that's going to be a lot of it. Also, I think we discussed looking at operational costs for operating a school that large as well, is what I recall in our conversations with them, in the amount of administrators and so forth. But I think it's more of a Board of Ed call and how the Board of Ed collectively wants to manage, if you want to go to a 6 to 8. But I haven't had to make that argument before. Those are kind of not the strongest of answers. I apologize. But that's based upon our conversation with the state.
Right. So we could come up with something that is persuasive that the state would, agree to, maybe. So the other thing is that in both of these scenarios, Humiston School just sits there and continues to be occupied, as far as I can see, until whenever. And that's going to require a lot of, capital improvement money or whatever, maintenance, that kind of thing. And is that, and maybe somebody asked this and I just didn't understand the answer. Are those additional costs, where are those taken into account in terms of, because if we were able to replace Dodd, for example, with the new middle school, and the Board of Ed and Humiston and maybe some other town offices could move to Dodd, that would obviously save us some money in terms of having to maintain a building that's over 100 years old and not really, I mean, it's lovely, but needs a lot of work. So, and I don't know I don't even know what my question is, but how is that factoring in? How did that factor in with the SMC? Just sort of thinking about that, and
I can answer that.
Take that offline as well.
Yeah. So again, with Humiston in particular, wasn't on, again, what we had said was the critical path of enrollment. So in terms of projects that would be required in phase one to alleviate that enrollment boom, it isn't necessarily required for that. However, in scenario 6, we could build the offices, 7,500 square feet, I think is what we were saying, into one of the new schools. But the question is always what to do with the alternate high school, which our understanding is a programming issue with the district. In scenario 2A, yes, Dodd comes offline and there's space available. And Humiston High School, the alternate high school, and the offices could be moved in there, but you're talking 15,000 square feet of that building with a lot more of open space, which would either be used as flex space for future renovations in that scenario,
Right.
or could be filled by, again, other things from the town. That wasn't in our, charge of what we could control there. I would say even in scenario 2A, if you were to do that, there still has to be a long-term home prepared for the Humiston facilities now. So if you were to move the alternate high school in there and the offices, you'd still need a long-term home for them elsewhere after the renovations. That's really what we had talked about as a committee. Ultimately, we're carrying a phase 2 cost in both scenarios to address a renovation or CIP at Humiston. So
Okay. Just one final
that answers what you're
comment,
looking for.
and I apologize, I'll be done in 1 second. The cost to the taxpayers, when I looked at the financial analysis, so the difference between 2A and 6 for the first 5 years seems pretty substantial, but when you go out over the entire, proposal, all phases, the difference is not actually that much. Am I reading the report correctly? Chuck or Jim Jascott or somebody that knows it.
Correct. Yeah, I think if you go out over the full 22 years, if you were looking at just phase 1 and you went out to 2046, or you took the average of it over that full 20 years, the costs are a lot closer than it is in the first 5. But again, that doesn't consider any other projects kind of coming online that would, make those change.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry to take so much time.
Thank you, Ms. Howland. Any other questions or comments from members of the Board of Ed or Town Council? Mr. White.
Thanks, Rob. So I thank the committee for all the work that you've done. This is fantastic. I really do appreciate it. I know it was a lot of hours. And I do support, I want to be clear on this. I support modernizing the schools, but I have just a couple of questions and comments here. I think it's important for us to have credibility with the public. And one thing that I've heard from some seniors in particular is when we hear about the age of the schools being 70 years, I mean, someone can correct me if I'm wrong here, but that includes like an age of the high school of being 70 years old, 65 years. The high school started as an L shape. It's now more than an H shape. So there have been additions after additions here. So to say that the facilities have an average age of 70 years, I think is misleading. And like I said, I just want the public to believe what we're saying. And this one in particular, I've heard about from people. Jeff, I don't know if you said this specifically. I know Peter asked about it originally, but with regard to the uptick, or actually Chuck Warrington, you might be able to speak to it. In your presentation, you mentioned the uptick in the kid population, the baby boom that we're having. Yeah. And so I think you said from 16 to 18, it's around 210 per year. What is the number right now? What's the percent increase that it's going up? I shouldn't say right now, but 5 years ago, 14, 15, what did it go up by to go up to 210 per year?
As far as births?
Yeah, births.
Let me see if I can pull that up.
It's around 50 students or 50 children.
I mean, that would be 33% year over year. After that, I mean, I think what we're seeing is the numbers historically have been below 200, like 180,
Okay.
185. This year, 165 for the kindergarten class was lower than, historically what we've
But that's
seen.
COVID, partly at least.
No, because we're talking about, these are kids born
They were already.
in Cheshire. They were born several years ago, 5 years ago, and now entering kindergarten. So the number born in 2016 isn't impacted by COVID. Next year, though, the number of kids born in 2017 was 205 from 165. So, I mean, not about 30% increase.
No, it's a big
And then
bump.
every year after that, it's over 200 for the last several years. So that's noteworthy. In terms of a percentage, I'm not sure.
No, that's fine. I mean, you said about 30%. That's fine. It went from about 180 to 210, just as a ballpark. And this year, I know it already went up to, we got the number, it was 220, over 220 for the year 2020, over 220 births. I think the number was 221.
I mean, the number of births, what you're seeing though, Tim, it's a function of several factors. One of them is aging population. When you look at the census of the town, the population has aged, and you'd think that might lead to fewer births. But what happens is the population increases in age, homes turnover. They're starting to sell homes, and when these homes get sold, people with families are buying them. So it's almost like a cyclical pattern where we've reached the end of one cycle of families, and we're turning it over, initiating a new cycle with younger families and more kids in school. We've added this year alone 37 students in grades K through 8. That's a really significant number for us. I mean, usually you'd expect it to net out close to zero over the course of a year. So to add 40 students over the course of the year is a pretty significant jump for us.
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you. Let me see.
The other thing, if I could just go back though, the other thing on the, add-ons to the facilities, in a lot of cases, I was the principal at Dodd, assistant principal there. I was 7 years. The majority of the building was built for a certain size population, let's say, 450 kids. And then the component on Park was added on that large area. And we were still, operating a kitchen for 500 with 900 kids in it. And tying old and new heat systems together, and those things also have a wear and tear. So, and I know you didn't mean like there was any effort to be disingenuous about the age of the buildings, but when we're talking about, I guess we could average in large additions in terms of their age, but that's something we'll take a look at based on your feedback.
I mean, literally, it's just, I literally have gotten eye rolls from some seniors. It's just like, this is just ridiculous.
What do you mean the high school's old? The front of the building is new. 21
Exactly. And that's what people see. So there's probably even other people in town. I'm just saying the description is, could be better, although it takes time to describe these things. So I'm just pointing that out. I appreciate what you were saying before, just about the sort of baby boom that's happening, because one of the points that's come up through the SMC work that I was unaware of, but it's just to be a little more clear, I think, on what you were alluding to, Jeff, which is the average age of homeowners in town has gone from, in 10 years, it's gone from 38 to 46.
Right.
So basically everybody sat in place for the last 10 years, and they're probably at some point in the not so distant future going to be selling. I think that there is an uptick in sales right now because of COVID. I think that will slow down, but I think even above and beyond that, you do have this this cyclical component that you were talking about. Let me see. One of the things in the SMC survey was 94% of the people wanting to saying that we should distinguish between needs and wants for upgrades. With regard to what you're doing, what comes to mind for me is under K. Just to be clear on this, for anything we do under K, is it required or mandated by the state?
So what the programs that we offer right now, we run a birth to 3 program. That's a state required program, not necessarily required for us to run the program, but we run the program and get reimbursed by the state. Birth to 3 doesn't take a lot of space.
Okay.
We are required to have transitional pre-K for special needs students.
Okay.
And we run that. We run beyond that through a Smart Start grant that we have from the state. So that basically runs at no cost to us, provides a tremendous service to community families. We definitely, most of the what we provide under kindergarten is designed to address special education needs.
Yeah,
most of it, again, not quote required by the district to run, but required by law to provide, through IDEA. But we don't have to be the provider. We choose to be the provider for most of this work, and it's a tremendous benefit to our students and something that we've led the way in across Connecticut for many, many years.
Yeah, no, and I asked this partly just because there's, the public is watching this, and I think this is an important point to highlight. And I mean, you've explained it to me before where, you have the kids who get caught early with something, and then you can address it earlier, and it could go away. Whereas kid gets caught later, it gets noticed later, I should say, and it could go on much longer.
Yeah, like anything else, early intervention is critical.
Exactly. Thank you. Let me see. Yeah, so I think I'm just gonna put this out there that right now, and I haven't heard anyone else say this, but I'm just gonna say it. I like option 6 better than whatever, the new middle school. I would like to personally, I mean, where I think I see it going is I'd like to see going forward on Chapman this year, but I'm not convinced about Norton moving forward with, a demolition and a new thing. And I know there's going to be more exploration of this, but I just want to say that I've already heard from several Norton parents. I don't really talk to a lot of Chapman parents, but I do have, my daughter at Norton School, and I have already spoken with a few Norton parents who, when I've asked them about that, they've just looked at me like, huh, what's wrong? And so there's my simple point with this is that I think would be a big lift moving forward with an entirely new Norton. It's not to say that it can't be done, but it will be a big lift. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. Other questions, Ms. Ham?
Thank you, Chairman Orris. And again, to the committee, thank you for all the work you've done. I haven't been as perhaps diligent as Adam in watching these meetings, but I've sat through a few of them, more than a few of them, and I applaud you for your perseverance. Mine are more just observations. Tim, I understand, I'm on that conveyor belt kind of moving toward the end of it, as that you're talking about. But things have changed dramatically in the last 2 decades in terms of what's required of public buildings, in terms of ADA requirements that we absolutely have to address, especially in a place like Hummiston. I'm not sure how we get away with some of the configurations in the building, but they're very real requirements, and we have to be serious about addressing them. Security, 25 years ago, I don't think we would have as much concern about security as we do now. Traffic congestion is huge in town. HVAC is changing. All of these do have to be addressed. And I'm with you. I would love to see an emphasis on renovation and looking at the reimbursement rates. Apparently the state seems to favor that option if you're getting, 45.72% versus 35.72 renovation versus new construction. But so I think we have to be able to find the words to explain to the elderly or to the older groups of town why we have to do this and what's been changing in just in society. But also, I just want to, with regard to Smart Start and those birth to 3-year-old, I know we get reimbursed and they supposedly seem they're at no cost, but here we are talking about the cost of providing space. So there are costs associated with it. And I hope that the state recognizes that and reimburses us appropriately. And I guess that leads to my bigger concern is how accurate are the state's own space standards. And, there's a lot of discussion now about how they're going to reconfigure reimbursement rates to favor Alliance District schools over school districts like ours. Is this something we should be concerned about, Chuck? Or is this formula pretty well set for a while? How?
As far as the reimbursement rate goes?
Yeah. And how the state's going to calculate it for a district like ours, which is considered a wealthy district.
How they're going to look at the reimbursement rate, it's an angelic formula that the Department of Education does it's statutory. So to my knowledge, I haven't heard of anything changing from what they've been doing year to year. Not to say it can't. I know there's a lot of discussions with like I said, the Alliance districts, but I'm not aware of any at this point. I think you might have asked about the space standard if I heard you correctly. That there's the one that we've been showing is the statutory space standard. Honestly, the state looks at it on a case-by-case basis. When we met with the state back in March, they were very clear that when we get to whatever the first project is, we have to draft the educational specifications. They're very clear. Make it in the front. We want to know what special programs you have in your building. And they do acknowledge the fact that the paras that are required in these programs, they're like another student in the room. There's more, people required. So they do look at it. And we've had this experience with other districts. We keep saying South Windsor, they had a medically fragile program that is a space hungry program. They do look at that, and they made the point themselves. Even the director, Costa Diamantis, made the point. Emphasize that. Let us know. We want to know exactly what those are, and they want to support it.
Okay,
but it is a balance. It is a balance with the ed spec. They're going to provide the needs, not the wants. They're going to support you 100% with your needs, but we can't get egregious in other areas and take advantage of it. They've seen enough programs over the years that they can go through your ed spec and weed through it pretty quickly and go, where you at.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ham. Ms. Nichols.
Thanks, Mr. Orris. I am pleased to hear all these general questions. I think this presentation by the committee has been well thought. There's a lot of very factual information, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it goes forward. And the questions that have come forward tonight have been very valid and good questions, not ones that we haven't heard before. So I think what I'm seeing here is this has been a great introduction to the work of the committee. And now, as much as I would like to say that we're through with meetings for a while, I think that it will be incumbent on the council and the Board of Education to continue these meetings to review all the questions that we have just brought up this evening. And I think there are many more, and there are many explanations. And I think we need to expect, as the project goes on, there will be many iterations and maybe combinations of scenarios. So I think we're doing our best tonight as a committee to give you the process that we arrived at to present these scenarios, and there are good pieces of each one. So I don't know if I were you and had not looked at this scenario as diligently as we on the committee have, there's a lot to understand, and there are a lot of questions that hinge one on the other. So I think we still have a lot of work to do to work together as the board and the town council to pull it all together. And we will arrive at a scenario between us that it's collaborative, that puts together. Ms. Hallen, you had some good questions, and Mr. White, you had some good questions, and Mr. Boroway had some good questions, all of which we've discussed, and we probably need to discuss again and again. So I look forward to that opportunity to continue the process. But the presentation we have tonight has been comprehensive, and there's a lot more information that we've compiled that will be available to both the council and the board to go through. So as a member of the committee, we've worked diligently. We've tried to bring you some options here. And I know that we are all here to make the best possible financial decisions for the town. And I've sat through the state meetings and all of the rest, and we all have some different perceptions, but I think we've got a great basis for this plan. And we're going to have many meetings like this in the evening to review those questions and have especially the Board of Ed come back to us with some of the ed specs that we need to put into these scenarios. So your questions are great. The presentation that Chuck and everybody gathered together for the committee has been comprehensive, and we still have a lot of work to do. So just my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Nichols. Other questions and comments from members of the Board of Ed or Town Council? I don't see any hands on my screen. Am I missing anyone? Mr. White, I see you have your hand back up.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, just one question for Jeff or for Chuck Warrington, I guess. In that report that you put together, I noticed something about it. It said expanded programs. Is that something you could speak to? I hadn't heard that before. I don't know if it's state mandates that you're anticipating, or.
I'm not sure. What are you referencing, Tim?
Well, if you go into the doc, you could just do a control find and do
Right,
expand.
Are you talking about the, I'm sorry.
Final report?
No, Arnett.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the final.
The SMC report.
Okay.
Oh, sorry for being unclear.
Well,
Yeah.
I just sent something out. I sent something to Arnett and she already sent it out. So I wasn't sure if you were referencing that recently distributed document or the report. Chuck, expanded.
It says expanded educational programs under, looking at 21st century learning environment.
I'd have to get the context. I don't, the context doesn't leap out to me off the top of my head.
Yeah, it didn't. It was it didn't say much except expanded programs. So
I think it's just a general factor. It's a general factor, not necessarily one that's specific to the schools, just 21st century learning environment in general, expanded educational programs.
Okay. All right. That I can accept. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. White. Other questions or comments?
I have one comment to make.
Yes, Mr. Jenks.
Thank you, Mr. Orris. Yeah, I just wanted to point out one sort of data point that was not included in the report, sort of as a comparison for the two, was utilization rate. Scenario 6. So this is looking at basically at the end of the decade. The utilization rate for scenario 6, which is the two new larger elementary schools, was I think we achieved a 97% utilization rate. With the scenario 2A, which is with the middle school, we were at a 95% utilization rate. So the two larger elementary schools, just based on those numbers, it gives us a less flexibility if we end up at the end of the decade with probably a higher student population than we're expecting now, perhaps. And that could happen given that we are, we're a strong school district already, and we're building new schools. That's probably going to attract even more people, which is probably going to add on to the trends that we're seeing now of turnover and higher birth rate. So we could end up at the end of the decade with larger elementary schools, and some of these are twice as large as they are now, with little flexibility and how to kind of expand the capacity of those schools at that point. So that's just a data point that I wanted everyone to kind of be aware of that wasn't included in the report. And I also had a question as far as the balance issue that we talked about earlier. It wasn't really something that we discussed much at all as a SMC that I recall. We did talk about in our last meeting a little bit. The balance or the numbers per school, kind of where they're coming out is more, it wasn't necessarily a goal, it's more of a byproduct of the plan. But there's a comment in the report that says that the unbalanced creates a different learning environment. I don't know if Jeff or Mr. Solon, Dr. Solon, if you would like to kind of comment on, do we really have a problem with or a challenge in the schools of different sizes being different learning environments? What I know about Highland and Chapman, for example, are those are our largest and our smallest schools. I think they're both really highly rated elementary schools. I don't know. I just want to kind of understand what that comment is there as far as the different learning environments.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily consider them, quote, absolutely different. I guess there are different cultures in each building just by sheer size of each building. That's why there's, particularly at the elementary level, that wheelhouse of 4 to 700. Like right now, Chapman falls under that. It's a very small school. Different resources for smaller schools versus larger schools. There are not. I have great faith in all 4 of our buildings, and of course, Darcy. But when we're talking about the full comprehensive elementary schools to provide outstanding educational experiences, but it's definitely a different vibe when you go to drop your child off at Highland and the number of cars you see there versus Darcy or Chapman for that matter. So, it's just different vibes in each building. Is it nice to have them balanced? Sure. Is it, requisite? No. But they are different environments. You just go to the building and the sheer number of kids, there's a different vibe. You know it when you're there.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Jenks. Other questions or comments? I don't see anybody. If there is somebody, please just jump in. Okay, not seeing or hearing anybody. I have really just a few kind of general comments. I have been paying attention to the process. I have a lot of very detailed questions and things that I think need some additional vetting. Obviously, tonight's presentation was just a summary of a very detailed process, as many of you have already said. And I think it's going to be incumbent on all of us to make sure that when something goes to the community for a decision, that we give them as much detail as we possibly can so that they can make an intelligent and educated decision. Because at the end of the day, this is going to be a big impact. No matter how we slice or dice this transaction, it's going to be a big impact, particularly financially, on our community. And we are going to need to make sure everyone who is voting for or against this has adequate amount of facts to make an intelligent decision. So that is really what I'm going to be trying to drive forward as chairman of the council in collaboration with the board and SMC, is to make sure we have a nice package that's ready to go to people to make the right decision. Getting back to a couple of really more general questions or comments, the process you've said has been a data-driven process. And that data really drove us immediately, or drove you all immediately, to enrollment, correct?
Correct.
So that's correct. Yep.
So really the needs or risks in our widget, so to speak, is what kind of drove the committee towards certain scenarios. And conversely, I think immediately eliminated some because the state would just not allow, in light of the data that was given to us for enrollment, to move forward with a plan, particularly initially, that didn't address that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'd say that's correct. The enrollment was a wild card.
Right. And I'm really just saying this for the public's edification.
Kind
So
of
we
changed
know
a little bit of
how
the
the
direction.
committee got down to kind of where you all got to. And so immediately it sounds like that eliminated the high school. There are a number of people in the community that have said, you know, geez, we really should start with the high school. And I'm not convinced that's a good or bad idea, but the data drove us to a scenario that was very different than that. And the state really would not allow that to occur because of the data. Is that accurate?
Yeah,
Yes.
Rob, if I could, I think it's about the phasing. It's not a matter of they wouldn't support it down the line, but to put that as a first school, them knowing how that large of a referendum would impact your debt service, and looking at the enrollment projections and how your capacities, you're going to be hitting your capacities at your K-6 level. They know that you're still going to have a problem there. So it's not really addressing the fact you're going to run out of room. I think, you know, if down the line it still supports it and you pass a referendum, the physical conditions of the school certainly need it, at least from when we walked through. And I'm sure if the state looked at it, they would probably concur, because there's multiple different eras, as we said. But to address that first before your enrollment projection, I think they would have a hard time supporting that phasing of the program.
So Chuck, that's actually my point, is that clearly all of the schools at some point are going to be part of a modernization plan. It's really the timing of which ones you do first. And
Correct.
The data drove us to not being able to do something like the high school up front because of the enrollment issues.
And a fiscally responsible plan. I mean, you could put in a plan with the 2 new elementary schools, but then you're talking $200+ million probably for a referendum. And then does that fall into the collective definition of fiscally responsible? And probably not.
So I'm just trying to give the public a little background as to really what kind of drove where the scenarios were heading. And I can just say this, that I am very open-minded as my vote on the council to any scenario. And at the end of the day, what needs to go forward is, one, a product that works for the school system and our children. And I think the Board of Ed really has to play a large role in that, because they're the experts in our community that can tell us what works and what doesn't work in terms of delivery of curriculum to our kids. The council, I see, as really much more of a fiscal player in this, and we need to make sure that we can roll this out in a financially affordable plan for this community, whether it be our residents and or our businesses. And those are the roles that I see we play. And so, you know, I have a lot of questions that are going to dive into the financials in both of these plans. I'm really hoping to focus on what was presented. Now, I know there's a lot of people that talk tonight about either scenario. I'm certainly going to focus on the one that the committee advanced to us through a 9-3 vote, first and foremost. That doesn't mean I'm not interested in looking at the secondary alternative plan or even any other plan that may crop up through our further deliberations. But I think it's important that we respect the findings of the SMC committee through the work that they've done, and try to focus on, number one, the scenario they're recommending, and then secondarily, the alternative. And if neither of those are workable, then obviously we have to look at some potential other options. And I suspect there's going to be some gyrations of both of these scenarios that we all may have some dialogue and deliberation on. But for me, this really means maximizing consolidations, gaining efficiencies where we can, and using as much of the excess space that we've identified within our system. And so, you know, I know Ms. Ham talked about ADA issues. I am really concerned about making sure that if we move forward a plan, phase 1, we can check off as many ADA issues as we possibly can. We owe our community and the people that use these buildings an opportunity to access our buildings without having to worry about whether they're accessible or not. So for me, that's another big checkoff, and that drives me towards the Humiston building also. And again, I don't want to get into too much detail, but I think it's incumbent on us to look at all of the buildings that have significant ADA issues and try to work them into a plan as soon as we possibly can. So really, folks, those are my overall thoughts. I have a lot of questions on all of these scenarios that I'm sure we're all going to hear as we move this further down the tracks. I'm looking forward to that deliberation, not only with SMC and the Board of Ed, but certainly the public. As I said, we will make a commitment to this community to ensure that this process from beginning to end is a transparent and collaborative process. And I believe it's been that. We will continue to offer that. We were going to find opportunities to let this community weigh in where and when they think it's appropriate. And so that will kind of lead us, I guess, to the next item on our agenda for tonight. But before we get to that, which is really what are the next steps, I want to, again, go back to the group. Are there any other questions or comments from members of the Board of Ed or Town Council? And if there aren't, I would certainly love to offer an opportunity for any member of the SMC to, to address the public, to address the Board of Ed or the Town Council if they so wish. So first and foremost, any other questions from Council or Board of Ed members? Seeing or hearing none. Are there any members of the SMC that would like to make a statement or address anybody? Okay, seeing or hearing none, then we will move on to, and again, thank you, Colliers and the folks from Colliers for all your hard work. I didn't mention you in the beginning, and I apologize. You also deserve a lot of kudos for the work that you did. I know it's not been an easy process to some extent, kind of working with 13 members of a committee, a 7-member Board of Ed, a 9-member Town Council, and a full community is not always easy. So, you both and all of your firm deserve kudos for that work. And I'm sure we're going to be working more with you as this continues down the road. And with that, I guess we're going to move on to a discussion regarding acceptance of the report and next steps. Clearly, we've accepted the report on both sides of the street, the Board of Ed and the Town Council. We're looking forward to getting into it in great detail. The next steps, as I see it, and I certainly look forward to, Chairman Perugini adding to this or any other member of the Town Council or Board of Ed to weigh in on this. But as I see it, the next steps really are the Town Council and Board of Ed will now begin a very detailed review and analysis of the proposal that we've heard tonight in a summary form and received a number of days ago in a very detailed form. I think some of this work will probably be done independently, meaning the Board of Ed will probably have some meetings on their own, which I'm sure will be public, but will be Board of Ed members only. And there may be some Town Council meetings done the same way, but I'm confident there will also be some collaboration between the Town Council and the Board of Ed. I'm confident we can't get to the best product without that. So I suspect the process will include all of that. Certainly to the extent that either body needs any additional information from the SMC, we will be reaching back to the SMC to the extent necessary. I also expect that the Town Council and the Board of Ed will be looking to advance the services of Colliers. I'm confident we're going to need their services as we continue this process down the road. Again, we're all going to be working towards ensuring the plan meets the school's educational needs and is implemented in a financially responsible manner. There's going to be plenty of more opportunity for members of the SMC and the public to participate now that it's been handed to the council and the Board of Ed. We have an August 31st, and Sean or Arnett, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we have a deadline of approximately August 31st for items going to referendum in the November election. So obviously the council and the Board of Ed are in budgetary process. We're going to be working on the capital budget over the coming months. So the timing of this is good. I'm hopeful we can advance a process that works within that timing. But at the end of the day, I think for all of us, it's about advancing a product that is best for this community. And so my commitment is this, that I will support it when and if we're at that point. I hope we're going to be at that point, in a time frame to move this forward for a November referendum. If we can't because the information isn't ready, then we won't. But I think we've got a lot of people here that have committed a lot of time and energy to this process. And I'm hopeful that with the timeframes I just mentioned, that we can move this thing forward in an expeditious manner and hopefully continue to gain ground. So that's how I see the process moving forward. I would, turn it over to Board of Ed Chairman, Mr. Perugini, if he would like to add to that, and then certainly open it up to any Town Council or Board of Ed member.
Thank you, Chairman Orris. Yeah, I iterate everything you just said. I was making some notes as you were speaking. Again, I want to thank the entire committee, all members, past and present, colliers, staff, both town and Board of Ed, all the non-elected volunteers that have served directly and indirectly in this committee. It's been a very long journey. Adam's watched many of the meetings, and we've often would talk about the next day. And there's a lot of great questions, a lot of great feedback, lots of data. And I think reflecting on what Chairman Orr said earlier, when something goes out to the public, especially for a referendum, I think both groups need to boil down that data to something that's meaningful and easy to digest. I'm sure as folks read through this detailed report and all the supplemental redistricting data behind it, they're going to have a lot of questions and probably get confused. So I'm with you, Chairman Orris. We're going to work together as we've always done in the past to make this something that's positive for the town and workable to everyone. We started debating these options about a few months ago when there were 3 or 6. At every board meeting, we spent probably a good part of the meeting now talking about the modernization options so that, we weren't really waiting for a final report to get started. We were waiting for a final report to get the final data and metrics in there. So both of these options are very promising. A lot of thoughts going into them. There's a lot of good data to drive those options. But, we both have, both bodies, a lot of work to do. Rob, you mentioned the fiscal side of things. Board of Ed has to look at ed specs now. And, I know Dr. Solon is working those up, refreshing the ones we have from 2017, as well as seeing, how those specs will apply to the new 6 model. But the most important thing for me, I think for most of the board, actually all the board, is we want sufficient time to get community feedback. Not just the entire community, obviously, but particularly our CPS community. Now there's 2 options, both of those, one's a traditional model, one's a little bit more new in terms of a 6 to 8 is move forward. I think parents and those stakeholders, be it employees or even businesses supporting us, kind of want to understand what it means to them, both from the education of our kids and ultimately, from the town side, from a cost perspective. So we're definitely going to work towards that. We'll continue having our meetings and definitely looking forward to schedule some collaborative meetings with town council. So I suggest we take a little bit of time to digest the report, gather our questions. I'm sure the board will have some questions for our modernization committee. You saw some puppet tonight, and I'd be more than happy to forward those over to Chuck to have those answered. And I'm sure town council will do the same. But we're in the same boat, Rob. We want to. We've been down this road once, back in 2017, and now we have much more data, a lot more folks involved. I hope the community's been paying attention. I know COVID's been rough for a lot of us, but I know this has been out there. So we're willing to work with everyone. But I agree with Rob. I want to have something that's viable and meaningful. And if it's ready, it goes out in November. If it's not, then we'll do a little bit more homework. But I'm pretty confident this time around, based on what I'm seeing, that we'll find something in these options that will work for us. So looking forward to working with you and the town council. And I just want to do one more shout out. I got to thank Marilyn. Marilyn has been a machine. I know town council gets to work with all the time, but my goodness, like we have these mammoth 3-4 hour long meetings, and then you figure all the subcommittee meetings, a day or two later, she produces the most detailed meeting minutes I've ever had. It's, if you haven't been at the meeting, you read those minutes, it felt like you were there and you didn't miss a beat on what was discussed. So Marilyn, I want to thank you as well, and Arnett too, for your tenacity and all this, and you're definitely committed to helping the town of Cheshire, as you both indicated, and I know you enjoyed doing this, but a big thank you. That's been a huge help for this committee and for most of us. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Chairman Perugini. Much appreciated. Before we move to adjourn, any other questions, comments from anybody? Seeing or hearing none, I hope the public is watching and found tonight informational. As I said, there'll be a lot more coming, and I'm looking forward to that process. So with that, I will look to entertain a motion to adjourn from members of the council.
So moved,
Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. We second.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. All those in favor?